Oh.
Now is almost go.
We'll try this again. Hello, everybody. Hope everybody's got a little bit of attention left after that. There was a lot of content in that last presentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about Eclipse, and as has been mentioned on the list, Eclipse is, one of a number of options for Joomla development, and almost most of the features we'll talk about today are also available in NetBeans and probably in other IDEs that I'm not familiar with. So first of all, how many people use Eclipse or another IDE right now? Can you, I don't know if can people raise their hands or something? If there's that raise hand button, I don't know if that works. Does anybody use Eclipse right now? Okay, Chad. Okay, Herman uses NetBeans. Javier uses Eclipse. Okay, great. We've got a lot of Eclipse users. Okay. Well then, maybe we don't need this talk anymore. Everybody knows about it. So, okay. Well, then it sounds like we may not have to spend a lot of time on the basics here, but let me just go through what I've got planned, and I'd like to make this interactive, especially since we've got a small group and since a lot of people already have experience. So I can touch a little bit on Eclipse installation and setup, but we may not need to spend a lot of time on that. And again, same thing with general features. It sounds like we probably don't need to spend time on that. And then some of the specifics I thought we would get into are using Git inside Eclipse, running PHP unit tests for the platform from Eclipse, and using the PHP debugger in Eclipse. And if there's any other topics that people want to touch on, please let me know, and if we have time, we can go into those as well. Does that make sense to everybody? Does that seem like covering the things people are interested in? Okay, great. Okay, now one thing that's important, if you're using Eclipse, how many people are using the latest version, 3.7.2, versus an older version? Because particularly for the Git support, there's been a lot of work in the last year or less to really improve the Git support. So it's really important to make sure you have the latest, very latest version. And the great news is that if you're using an older but still fairly recent version like 3.5 or 3.6, it's really easy to install the new version without having to uninstall your old one or without having to commit to it. You can try it, and if you have problems, you can always go back to your old one. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If you're going to get the latest version, unfortunately, the PHP project, which is called PDT, is not they don't have their own download anymore. Somebody fell off the wagon. So the simplest thing to do is to get Eclipse IDE for JavaScript web developers. And then it's super easy once you have that installed to update and add eGit and add PHP. So all you need to do that, if you once you have Eclipse installed, you just go install new software, select the releases, Indigo releases, because that's the name of the 3.7 version, is Indigo. And then it takes a second here to pull up. And then basically under collaboration, you say git and under programming languages, you say our favorite programming language, PHP, and then you just follow through, and this will automatically download these latest. And the thing about the folder structure is that the location of the Eclipse binaries is not important. Those can be anywhere. So you can have as many different versions of Eclipse as you want. For example, I've got, I don't know how many of them here. I guess I've just got 6 of them right now. The thing that is important, excuse me, is the location of your workspace. So you can have as many different Eclipse binaries as you want. Typically, you don't want to mess with your workspace too much because that's where you've got all your preferences and your existing projects and all that kind of stuff. But if you are running Eclipse 3.5 or 3.6 and then you install 3.7 in a new folder for your binaries, you can still point to that same workspace. And you can even go back and forth. You can close the 3.7 version, go back to your 3.5 version if you want, if something's messed up or whatever. And also, if you want to get the new, keep getting newer versions. Like when I get the latest, greatest Eclipse, I'm always a little bit leery, so I just install that in a new version and try it out. And then if I don't like it, I just go back to the old version. So it's super easy to work with different versions and not mess with your workspace. Okay, so it sounds like we probably don't need to spend a lot of time on general features of Eclipse. I assume most people are aware of how to do search, how to do file comparing, how to look at the PHP class hierarchies, what classes extend a particular class and so on, use the code completion and the PHP outline and that kind of stuff. Does anybody have any questions about some of these sort of the general features of Eclipse? So everybody pretty comfortable with those. Okay. Let me just touch briefly on the file folder setup. I mentioned that your workspace is important where you put that. And there are different strategies. There's no one best strategy for something like this. I like to keep things very simple. So this is my Windows system. So htdocs is the root of my Apache web folder, whatever you call it. So I just create a folder under that called Joomla development, and then that's where I have my Eclipse workspace, and then all my different web-based PHP projects just go inside there, each as a separate folder, and then that way I can run them directly from there. I don't have to copy anything or link anything. And I think that's probably how most people set it up, but just in case, and there are other ways to do it as well, but that to me seems the simplest. Okay. So one thing that how many people use launch configurations in Eclipse and are familiar with that, launch and debug and external program configurations? Because that's a pretty cool feature of Eclipse. Are people familiar with that, or would you like to spend a bit of time on that? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so basically there are these 3 buttons here. This is for the debugger, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is for your regular launch configurations, and then this is for external tools. Okay, so on the launch configurations, basically these are just ways to create shortcut commands for running different applications, either web applications or PHP scripts, just with the click of a button. So for example, anytime I set up a project, I'll create, like I have a CMS, this is my CMS trunk project over here. So I'll create two launch configurations, one for the front end and one for the back end. And they're just real simple, but they just save you a lot of time. So my front end is just going to execute the index PHP out of this, Joomla project, and go to this URL. So, and it's associated with xdebug, so I can either debug from this launch configuration or I can run. So if I go and say run backend CMS trunk, for example, that launches the administrator index file, and that just is a one-click way to get my Joomla session started from a particular project. And then you can also use the same thing for scripts. So if you're working with a project that is a script, like I've got this guy here, that's just a simple script, I can just, of course, do run as CLI application, but if I wanted, one of the nice things about the run configurations, oops, I didn't want to do that. One of the nice things about the run configurations is that I can pass arguments. So if I have a complicated command and I want to pass arguments, and we'll see that when we set up like the unit tests or some of these things, you can save that. And again, it's just a time-saving thing that works. And then when you debug, that's how you start a debug session in Eclipse as well. Now the external tools, and we'll talk about this when we look at the unit tests. You can run any kind of program you want. So it doesn't. This is not running. This is running an external program. So for example, somebody asked about the check code style. We can run the PHPCS bat file. Again, this is for Windows, so there's a bat file for it. And then we can do cool things like, for example, the working directory is our project location. So we can use this configuration for any of our projects. And then, there's a lot of arguments you have to worry about for the check code style. So we can hard code those in here, and we don't have to remember those or type them or whatever. And this is also a cool thing that this $ resource location is the current resource we're pointing to. So if I want to check the code style of a particular program, like I'm pointing to this program and I do check code style, it will run that. Whoops. Oh, I don't have the code style that's set up for the platform. Okay. Let's go to the Okay, so I want to check the code style of a particular program. I point to that program, and then I can say check code style, and it'll throw that in there. And you got your logs there, so then you've got, oops. And it didn't find any problems with that check style. Okay, so we'll get into some more specific examples about the launch configurations when we talk about specific things. Okay, let's just talk really quickly about the folder structure. So I mentioned we have a workspace, and that holds projects, and then each project is an instance of an app. And then if you're working with Git, the simplest thing by far is just each project has its own Git repository. And then, of course, within a repo, you can have as many branches as you want. Okay, so Now let's just talk really briefly about the Eclipse visual structure, because I think a lot of people don't know how this, don't know necessarily how flexible all this stuff is. Let's say I pull up, you know, I think of this is probably hopefully a typical, a familiar display for everybody. You've got your edit area here in the window. I've got the PHP outline that shows me the methods and other members of this class. And I've got my PHP Explorer over here, and I've got a number of different windows going on down here. The important thing to understand is that this is all completely user-defined. I mean, you can grab these guys and move them around. You can launch a new window and, you know, move it to another monitor. You can customize these perspectives any way you want. So you know, there's nothing written in stone here. And just to make sure everybody's clear on the terminology, Eclipse uses what they call a perspective, which is a collection of views in a particular layout. And then each view is one of these little windows here. And then you can change perspectives. For example, when we look at the debug, it automatically changes to a debug perspective, which is just a different way of looking at what's going on that's more suitable for debugging than for editing. Okay? Okay, so that's it for general sort of Eclipse features, unless anybody has any particular question or thing that they wanted to dive into. Okay, so no. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. No, I have a different way I do that. Javier's posted a question in Skype, and it's not that one way is better than another. This is just the way that I like to do it, which is I will have a separate project just for my component. In fact, let me go. Well, yeah, let me do that. I have just updated to a new version of AMP, so I'm sorry, Chad, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, are you saying you'd rather have me answer questions at the end of the talk, or to repeat the question? Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. So the question is, other ways to set up the project. Now, why isn't this showing me my? What's going on here? Okay, well, let me go back to where I was. Sorry about this. So there's an article in the wiki that we wrote a couple of years ago about how to, and this is pre-Git, about how to do extension development, and it was based on from I'm doing. And basically, it's just a different strategy. And what it is to create a separate project and this is specifically for developing an extension. So what I do when I develop an extension is I have a separate repository and a separate project just for that extension, and the folders are structured in the way that they're going to be structured inside the zip archive that I'm going to create, when I publish the extension. And of course, the disadvantage of that, as Matt pointed out, is that you can't actually execute the code directly from that project. So what I do is I will install that extension in another Eclipse project that is not even necessarily tracking version control, and that's where I do the testing and the coding and so forth. And then I use a thing script, where you could use ant as well, to just copy the files from the test project to the project that's actually under version control. So the disadvantage is that you do have this extra step, which is you have to copy the files from the test project to the project under version control. But the advantage is that your project that's under version control only has the files that you're working on. The other advantage is that you can be uninstalling the, I like to test the install and uninstall when I'm working on an extension. And of course, if you uninstall something and it deletes all your files, then you've got to, recover those and stuff. So I find it easier just to have two separate projects and then have a copy thing back, and to get things back into the thing, because I agree absolutely with Matt that it's easier, it's much better to be coding and debugging and testing and everything inside, inside the CMS if you're developing an extension. That's usually the best way to do it. And there's an article in the wiki that documents that in pretty good detail. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about eGit, which is Eclipse's implementation of Git. And first of all, I agree with Matt that it's good to be familiar with the command line stuff, and also there are the eGit I find very helpful for doing the basic tasks that you do on a daily basis. And it's just has the advantage of using a graphical user interface over a command line interface if you're a GUI type person. But there are definitely some commands that you might want to do or need to do in Git that are not available in eGit. They're adding more as things go along. But so I generally use a mix. Fortunately, I'm able to do most of what I need to do in the eGit. Typically, the first thing you're going to do when you are setting up a new project that's going to be under version control, and this is one of the hardest things, so that's why I thought I would kind of walk through, is you want to set up a new project that is tied to a repository, and unfortunately, that's not as easy in Eclipse as it ought to be. So I wanted to document that. Let's see here. Okay, let's go back here. Okay, so basically the basic steps. So we're going to create a new project that's tied to a remote repository on GitHub. And the first thing we're going to do, and it's the same steps that you would do if you were doing it manually, and you could, one very important thing that I want to make clear is that you can mix and match the, eGit and command line commands. You can, so that there's no, it's the same Git repository, it's the same, the commands have exactly the same effect. So you could do some commands, you could create a branch in the command line and then use it in Eclipse, or create it in Eclipse and use it in the command line. They're all working on the same thing. So we have, when we have Git installed, we have this thing called the Git repositories view, and it has a button here called Clone a Git repository. So the first step that I do if I'm going to create a new project is do the clone, and then it asks you, and I just did this for another one, so it's got this URL in there, but I don't want that one. I got to go back to GitHub, and I have my Learn Git project here, and I found this little dashboard here kind of confusing when and basically if you're using SSH, then you want to make sure you've got that tab. You can also use HTTP, so it just depends on whether you've got your SSH is set up, or if you find it simpler to use HTTP. In this case, I've got SSH set up, and so I can click here to copy the read-write URL. And this is the same thing you'd do if you're using the command line. Then I go back here to Eclipse and paste the URL. And I indicate here I am using the SSH protocol. Enter my password. Oh, actually, I always forget this. It wants it there. And then, I'm tracking the master. And then this is very important. This is where I'm going to put the repo. And for some reason, the Eclipse documentation is kind of confusing on this. They tell you not to put the repo in your project, but that's the only way I can make it work, and that's I think the way others make it work as well, is to put the Git repo right at the root of your project. So I'm going to create a new Eclipse project called Learn Git, and that's also the location of the Git repo. This is my local clone of the remote repo. So it creates that. So now I've got this new project down here. It's already got my remote. It knows that my remotes are from GitHub. And now I just go File, New PHP project. I'm going to call it the same thing because that's going to be my folder. So now it tells me this already exists. It's got stuff in it. That's what I expect. And now I'm almost done. The problem is that it's not smart enough to know that this project is associated with this repo. So I have to go Team, Share Project, Git, and then this is the key thing here. User create the repository in your parent folder or project. And now now that it knows that these guys are under version control. For some reason, it takes a minute for the little guys to show up, or there's little decorators that show up when it's under version control. If you close and open it, then they show up. So now I've got my little guys there that tells it. And now also if I go right-click on that project and go Team, I get the full menu of Git commands. So that's what's involved in setting up a new project under Git. And you do the same thing if you had a fork of the CMS or a fork of the platform. And again, it automatically creates your remotes down here. And then if I wanted to add a remote, like if I wanted to this isn't a good example. If I wanted to add a remote here that was the upstream, the repo that I forked from, then I could just do create remote there and it would add. Or I could again do the command line as Matt showed. So does that make sense? Any questions about that? I wanted to show there are a few things that I think where the eGet is really nice. For example, if I go in here and show history, this is, to me, a much more usable interface to the Git history than trying to do. You can do stuff command line here, but it's a lot easier. For example, somebody asked about how to revert a change. If you want to revert a commit, you just highlight the guy you want to revert and hit Revert Commit, and that will just it doesn't change your history. It just changes the local copy, and then you can commit that, and then it's basically a commit that you could have in your commit message. Revert commit blah blah blah. So there's nothing you can do here that you can't do with the command line. It's just a lot easier. And the same thing if I wanted to switch to a branch, it's just a lot easier for me, and I don't have to keep track of exactly how I name the branches or type in the commands. So yeah, so I like the history, but it's also got a pretty nice conflict editor. I'm not going to try to demonstrate that. That gets a little bit intense. But when you have conflicts, it has a nice thing. You can also create diffs automatically from Eclipse without having to type a command line. So the other thing that's really cool here is the way it ties in. For example, if I'm sitting here on a commit and I want to see what was changed, then you just double click on it, and you've got your nice little Eclipse compare editor. So any questions on eGit before we jump to the next thing? So again, important to get the latest, greatest version of Eclipse if you want to use eGit. Okay, let's move right along here. Time is passing. Let's talk about PHP unit tests. How many people are going to be, I don't remember, there are a number of the projects are platform projects, right? Yeah, so this, yeah, okay, great. So that's going to be important then. Okay, well, first of all, the hard thing about, for me at least, for getting the PHP unit tests going is doing the whole pair thing. I don't know if anybody else, I think I'm pair impaired or something, but I always seem to struggle with that. But once you get the right unit of PHP, the right version of PHP unit installed, dealing with stuff inside Eclipse is pretty easy. What I do is I use this external tools configuration, and I create a configuration that lets me just test any individual unit test just by pointing and clicking. So again, I'm using this. This is a nice. This $ resource loop just means the current resource that I've got highlighted in Eclipse. So here we're just, we're running the PHP unit against this resource. So for example, if I come into yeah, I can export those. They're also documented in the wiki, but it's easy enough to export. So for example, if I'm in the platform here and I come into the unit test and I point to a test, J-axis test, and then I say selected platform unit test, it runs in my little guy there. And if I think I can actually, if I select a folder, it'll run all the guys in that folder. So it's just, again, I'm lazy and I like to make things as simple as possible. So when you're developing and you're working on a unit test, that's a good way to do it. What's the right PHP unit? What I did was change, yeah, I think the right version of PHP unit is this 3.5. I think you can use 3.6 as well. If you go out to pair and you install now, I think you get 3.6, and I believe it works. I have 3.5 because that came with my latest version of XAMPP. And then it's a little confusing because we don't really use unit tests for the CMS at this point. I think there's a project to address that, but we use a lot of system tests, and the system tests are also built on the PHP unit testing framework. So I just had been behind on the version, so I just updated. So now the CMS system tests also use this version of PHP unit. Now, one thing that's a little harder is debugging unit tests, and that takes a couple extra steps if you want to be able to do that. And that okay. So in order to debug a unit test, and again, this is documented in the wiki. Okay, the question is, are we using PHP unit for the CMS or not? At the present time, we are not. When the unit tests were developed originally in the CMS, but they were only testing the libraries Joomla, the library/Joomla folder, which of course then became the platform. So once the platform project was split off from the CMS, we aren't doing unit tests per se in the CMS anymore. We still have the folder out there, but those tests aren't being maintained. They're being maintained over in the platform. Yes, it's very good for new projects to have their own unit tests. And we also, with version 3, we will be moving, we have actually some classes, and we'll be moving a lot more classes into this library/CMS folder. And so we're going to want, the CMS project will need to write and maintain unit tests for those files. Plus, there's no necessary reason why we couldn't write unit tests for other CMS classes outside the libraries folder. It's just that we haven't done it to date, and some of them are, things that display a lot of output are not necessarily easy to write unit tests for. And we have the system tests that test the system from a user point of view by running by running the system through a browser. So it gets a little confusing, that's for sure. Okay, running short on time here. Let me just give you, do people want to see a quick, how many people use the Eclipse debugger? Does anybody use the debugger? Do people want to see, is it worth it? Because if you're already familiar with that, then we don't need to go into that very much. So Aaron, you never use it. Is that because you don't know how, or you don't need it? Ah. Have you ever used any debugger? Oh, okay. Well then, yeah. Okay. Well then, I don't need to spend time on the Eclipse debugger. Why don't we've only got a few minutes left. Why don't we open it up for any other questions that people have? And if it's easier, you can unmute your mic and ask the question. No questions? Do I get an early lunch? This is great. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Eclipse over other IDEs? Well, the two main free IDEs that I know about are Eclipse and NetBeans, and they're very, very similar. The one, I'd say NetBeans has the advantage that it's easier to set up for PHP development, and that it's got better documentation from NetBeans. And I'd say the advantage of Eclipse is that there are more plugins, more third-party plugins for Eclipse. And the last time I checked, NetBeans didn't have this external tools, the ability to easily run things right from the IDE, which for some people isn't a big deal. There are many more similarities between the two IDEs than there are differences. If you actually look, I mean, they're almost screen for screen similar in terms of, searching, comparing, debugging, seeing, all the kind of basic things. Some people like the user interface of Eclipse. Eclipse uses the native widgets from your operating system. So if you're running Windows, it looks like a Windows app. If you're running Mac, it looks like a Mac app. Whereas NetBeans uses Swing, the Java Swing interface. So it has a very consistent interface across different operating systems, but it doesn't look like a native app on any of those operating systems. Any other questions? How to add Joomla as a library. Huh, you mean, as a PHP library in Eclipse? Huh, I've never done that.
Hi, Javier speaking. Yeah, I saw the other day a video of Andrew Eddy. He was working the component, and he has in the project libraries, he has Joomla on it.
Well, you can. Oh, that's interesting. Well, you can. I mean, you can configure your include path to add libraries, and you can. I never tried that, but you can add any. You can add. You can add libraries here. Add external source folders. You probably would just add it there and point to your folder. I've never played with that. That would be. I never thought about that. That's an interesting idea. But you would do it by just adding the include path here, adding external source folder, and then browse to whatever folder where you had the Joomla instance. And that would what that would do is then add that to your into here. Huh, I never thought of that. Anything else? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. And I'm around if people do have questions or problems getting things set up.
Okay, and I can't stop the recording anymore, so Chad, I think you took over as host. Can you stop it?
Yep, I can do that. Okay. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.